your offspring are more sacred than your property, even though both should never be messed with.
Well, that's for sure. You got any other thoughts on it? Like what makes your offspring more sacred than your property? Like what are some kind of common themes? What are some character traits that your offspring might have that your property does not have, and vice versa?
Well, nobody, no man or no other woman could ever have any higher vested interest in my offspring than other than myself or my wife, spouse, partner, other. But property, the state always seems to find a way to interject themselves itself into the private dealings of property between man, or man and woman, or woman and woman.
Well, I
And they
mean,
seem to be overreaching with the offspring as well.
that's kind of what I was gonna add. Are there any other kind of qualities or character traits you can think of?
It's living and breathing. Your offspring are living and breathing and in actual connection to you.
Okay, so what would make that a little bit different from a dog? I mean, a dog's living and breathing. I mean, I'm connected to my dog. I mean, not as much as I am to my offspring. But I mean, the dog is living and breathing, and I would say in most instances, people would look at a dog as property, right? Like if your dog goes and bites somebody, you're liable for it. Although I guess if your offspring goes and messes up somebody's property, the parents are liable for that too. But what kind of separates it?
Well, there's a soul with my offspring. My creator, our creator, the creator, has entrusted myself uh, along with, we're in a sacred trust. I don't have a sacred trust with the dog. I
I
like
don't
dogs
know. I
too,
think
though.
the dog might disagree, man. I think your dog would be like, "We're not in a sacred trust." What
This
about
whole
all those
time?
Scooby snacks you gave me?
Yeah, see, that's a gradual earned trust there.
So, well, I mean,
How about if, and this might just be adding something else to it, but assets have to do with someone who is dead, deceased. But it would also include land and property. So that would be different than your children, I would think, who are alive and have blood in them and they come forth from you. So there would be much more of a bond of love as opposed to it just being a piece of property like a land or a state.
well, and I think that that's a really good thing to bring up because the love is for sure. I mean, in my opinion, the love is for sure what creates or is definitely derived from the sacred trust between you and the creator of all things, which everybody has that sacred trust. Everybody has a creator, and their creator loves them. And that's kind of a principle that people should have when looking into this stuff and thinking about it, because really without that kind of principle, I'm not saying that this stuff won't work at all, but I'm just saying that you might not understand it as well as you could. Anyways, with that being said, uh, what one difference, and you kind of pointed this out as soon as you started your commenting, Oracle, but one difference that you pointed out is that assets are very different from property because assets are property of a dead person. So property
Yes.
is different from assets because property, like if you own land and it was your property and not your asset, then that would mean that you were living and you would have different rights to it. Um, and that's probably another topic for another day. But it's a good thought, and it's something that we should go more into at a later point in time. But I just wish to kind of point that out for the moment. But getting back to the sacred trust and the sacred bond, you create your offspring. In fact, one of the definitions for offspring is anything you create. Okay. So if you create it, and we talk about being a free man, a free woman on this show. And so you have sacred rights, you have divine rights, you have sovereign rights. That does not make you a sovereign. You're not sovereign over anyone else. You just have sovereign rights like everybody else. Everybody has sovereign rights. And so it brings in the law of sovereigns. And basically, the law of sovereigns is I can't step on your toes, you can't step on my toes. And once somebody starts stepping on some toes, we're going to have a problem and we got to call court. Right, Monarch? Can I get an amen?
Yes, sir. Amen.
So anyways, with you being the creator, since your children don't exactly have rights yet, or your offspring, and you're the creator, you kind of bestow your own rights upon them, kind of like your creator bestowed rights upon you. And you grew to learn how to cautiously and very responsibly, eloquently exercise those rights and utilize them in your day-to-day life. And so the creator kind of, as the creator's kind of led you to this position in your life, in my opinion, he probably wishes for you to do the same thing with your offspring. And so you can extend the rights that you have to your offspring. Now, the thing about this is that your offspring are still infantile in law, which means that they cannot exercise their own rights. It's kind of like I tell my offspring all the time. He lives under a benevolent dictatorship. He'll say, let's vote on something, And I'm like, vote? Nope.
Yep.
You live
Yes,
under
sir. That's a tricky balance.
which part?
Ruling a home as a benevolent dictator, and yet also teaching freedom,
Yeah, and trying to keep everybody happy. It's difficult trying to keep everyone happy, even when you just got like a small family of 4.
Yeah.
Conflicting interest will always happen. So, but yeah, like with your creation, you can bestow rights upon them. And this is why I think it's kind of silly, this whole idea that the state tries to uphold children's rights. Like children have to have rights. Children have never had rights before in history. I don't think we should really start now. And the reason they haven't is because they've always been subject to their creators, to their parents. And I think that's a much better way to go, because whenever you start talking about, especially in the sense of the state, whenever you start talking about children's rights, well, now who gets to enforce and uphold those rights? And obviously, the state, being the awesome, benevolent sovereign that it is. If anybody didn't catch that, I was being a little facetious. Anyways, but they believe that they should be the one to declare whatever those rights are, and that they should be the one to uphold them. And that is a very, very scary place to be. That is a very,
Terrible.
very worrisome place to be, because now you're taking it away from, history, where it's worked very well since time immemorial, the creators of that little bundle of joy. And you're putting it into what has not worked very well throughout all of history. And that is the hands of the state, or the hands of the government. And of course, I just say the hands of the state or government because the word government really didn't come around until the late 16th century, early 17th century. But again, that's kind of another story for another day. But the state has been around since Athens, Greece, the time of Rome, and even before then. And it's never worked out well. Most of them have collapsed over history. And the ones that are still around will collapse at some point in time. This is kind of a mathematical fact. So the other thing is that people who work with the state or come from the state, or even if they're just good people, they can never love your offspring as well as you can. It just can't happen. Now, they can have love for children. They can adopt children and they can care for them and love them. And, sometimes it's way better than other things that could be happening or other things that could go on. But, somebody else is never going to love your offspring the way that you do. It's just not going to happen. And even statistically, they know that most of the children who get taken by the state, they end up in worse situations. They're more likely to be abused. They're more likely to get into heavy drug use. They're less likely to be successful as an individual growing up. We know all of these things, and yet we still have programs where we keep on taking more and more children. It doesn't make sense. And in fact, the programs, if we didn't keep taking more and more children, would not be funded, and they wouldn't be funded as well as they are, which is why we keep on taking more and more children. And again, in my mind, that's kind of absolutely ludicrous. There's just no point to it. So,
in fact, once upon a time, I knew this man who sometimes acted in the capacity of street pharmacist, and he was telling me one of the things that resonated with him that he had heard from a judge was he went to jail for a long time because he purchased some property, some possessions from somebody, and they turned out to be stolen, and he got twice the punishment as the thief himself. And the judge said, if it wasn't for people like you around, we wouldn't even have thieves. The relevance of that is when you're financially incentivized to callously take in somebody else's children, you have no true, genuine incentive necessarily to love on them, to love them the way, a mom or a dad would. Point being, the courts keep funding programs to place offspring with somebody else, and that demand drives the supply. So they keep stealing more and more. And we know that government program has to justify its existence every fiscal year by increasing in size and productivity.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would like to add to that is that it's not the courts funding these things, it's technically the legislatures. But the legislatures are just a different type of courts. Just normally when you say courts, people's minds automatically go to courts of justice, which are, downtown, the building that you go to whenever you get arrested and you have to go answer for the pretended offense that they just probably charged you with.
Right. The judicial side, which has quite its own evils, it needs to be eradicated.
Well, for sure. I mean, and the thing is that if you get the judicial side in order, the rest of the government will fall in order very, very quickly. If you have judicial accountability and the judicial officers start getting held accountable, I'm going to tell you right now, quickly after that, cops are going to start being held accountable, politicians are going to start being held accountable, and corporations will start being held accountable if judicial officers are held accountable for what they do. And that's why historically, when the law of the state has gotten real out of hand, people have gone after the judicial officers first because they never saw a king. They never saw a parliament. Yeah, they would get pretty upset at these soldiers who would come to take their property. But, what they saw as the root cause, the root signature that was being put on the pen before the swords went out was the judicial officer. And that's why, judicial officers historically, have been kind of the first ones in that governmental system to really get the repercussions of some of the governmental policies that the king and parliament would enact.
Right.
So,
And that's logical, because everybody knows the king's going to be a king and try to, gain land and take what he will. But the judicial officer is seated in honor and is supposed to be there to ensure that your rights are protected, and that won't happen, and everything's at least fair.
well, that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. Yep.
It's kind of the whole idea of